I'm so glad I got tires on this thing. This is still a much more enjoyable car to drive. More interesting, less boring, more fun than my last car. So there's that. I'm thankful for that. My last car was a 02 Subaru Outback. Piece of garbage. I'll say there was a couple of things about it that I really did enjoy. It was really, really cheap, and I had it for what, 3.5 or 4 years, something like that. And it never once, not one time, broke down on my wife or I. Took it up into the mountains, drove all around in the mountains, took it up, you know, on legitimate mountain passes, like unpaved, just boulder roads, not even like gravel roads, like just rocks, big rocks, kind of laid out onto the side of a mountain, and that's what you drove on. I took it out on that. Never once had an actual issue with it. It's freaking awesome in the snow for a car. Never got it stuck, never left me stranded, and it was $700, and that was the best car purchase I ever had. But it was automatic, and it was a piece of junk. Like, it really was a piece of junk. But it was a good car, I just hated it, right? So this, I haven't had it long enough to say whether it's a good car or not, but it is definitely more interesting, much less boring to drive, because it's a 5-speed. That's the only thing about it that is objectively better than that Subaru. It was more expensive. It's not nearly as nice. The Outback was fully loaded because it was, well, it had just under 200,000 miles on it when I bought it. And when I sold it, it had, I think, 230. We put about 35,000 miles on it, I think it was. So, I mean, we got our money's worth out of it, and I sold it for more than I paid for it. So before the Outback, and the reason why it didn't help that I hated the Outback so much is because I had what was the closest thing to my dream car that I will probably ever own. Or a dream car, maybe not the dream car, but for a very, very long time when I was younger, I wanted a 1994 Mitsubishi 3000 GT VR4, which, if you know anything about those cars, maybe you know what that is. If you don't, the 3000 GT was a car that Mitsubishi made in the 90s when they released it. For the first several years, it was significantly ahead of its time in terms of technology in it and all that stuff. And the VR4 was the top package. Is 3-liter V6 twin turboed, all-wheel drive, all-wheel steer, and it also had active adjustable suspension and aerodynamic. This car did that in 1991. It was, far ahead of its time in terms of what technology you would see in a car that was actually affordable for the common man back in the early 90s, which that what some people decide to call them was the poor man's Ferrari. I don't necessarily care for all of that, but when I was little, I saw one. I was like, I want that. What I ended up getting when I turned 22 was I found myself a 96 3000 GT SL. SL is basically one step down from the VR4. It was not all-wheel drive, it was front-wheel drive, and it was naturally aspirated. That being said, it's the fastest car that I had ever owned, and still to this day have ever owned. It's the only sports car that I've ever owned. And I loved that car so much, even though it wasn't really what I wanted. I spent a lot of money on it. I spent a lot of time on it, and I really enjoyed it. I really had fun with it. It was good. It was a good car. It only left me sort of stranded once. All the years that I owned it, all the miles I put on it, and I put a lot of miles on that car. But it only sort of left me stranded once, and it was a fluke what happened, I'm pretty sure, because it never did it again. And I was driving it, we'll say, really aggressively up into the mountains. So I think between just pushing it pretty hard and the very quick change in elevation messed with it and caused it to actually like siphon the coolant out of it, and it overheated. But I had no issues with it after I let it cool down, put more antifreeze in it. It never did it again. I was able to shut it off, realize what was happening, shut it off in time. I think it was just a fluke, weird set of circumstances. But it's been by far my favorite car. This car is alright, but man, I miss that 3000 GT. Even as many problems as it had, it was still a really great car to me. And even though it wasn't what I really, really wanted, it was still an excellent car. Those things are heavy. Stupid heavy. Well, I hadn't really thought about it, and I was, a relatively young kid. And so when I bought the car and I drove it home, I lived on a gravel road, and as soon as I hit that gravel, I realized why it was so freaking heavy. The whole car is made out of steel, which as soon as I hit the gravel road and the tires were picking up the rocks and throwing it into the inner fenders, I realized, because it just go ding, 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 hitting metal. And it was like, a light bulb was like, oh, this whole car is made out of steel. There's no fiberglass or plastic parts on it, which there are. The bumpers and the skirts are fiberglass. But the rest of the dang car is steel. Solid steel. And it is heavy. Maybe one day I'll have another one. I doubt that I'll ever be able to afford a VR4. At one point I was like, yeah, I'm gonna have a VR4 and I'm gonna import from Japan a GTO, because that's what they were called in Japan. Mitsubishi called them a GTO. I was like, it's gonna be so cool, because I'm just gonna have like identical cars, except this one's gonna be from Japan and right-hand drive. Maybe one day I will have another 3000 GT. I'm still sort of in contact with the guy I sold mine to. But I don't think I'd ever want that one back. For one reason, really one reason, is it was red. And I hate red cars, which is ironic that my favorite car that I've ever owned was a color that I hated. And I was always planning to repaint it. different color, and there were a number of different colors that I thought I was going to paint it at different times, but it never happened because, I mean, it's a project car, and it was my only car. So there's just so many things that I wanted to do, that I needed to do on it, that never happened. But maybe one day I will own another 3000 GT.